theme?
We don't have quantity today, but we have quality. At least we'll reassure ourselves of that. The Daily, as usual, didn't print things. I want to call your attention to the next lecture on this summer series. Will be next Thursday in this room at 3. Dr. Marguerite Scruggs, who's Assistant Dean of Women at the College of Home Economics, and I believe is chairman of the University Committee examining the status of women here, which I think should be examined, will speak on the status of women. The man we have this afternoon is a longtime friend of mine, Robert Bernard. I asked him for a vita, and I didn't realize, even though knowing him for a long time, rather impressive vita. But with bachelor's from St. Thomas in 1958 with a majors in French and English, and then he went astray and went into French apparently. His Master of Arts is the University of Kansas, and the subject was the medieval dramatic confraternities and their repertoires. And then he studied a year in France, 60 to 61, and taught Lycée there, and also attended the Sorbonne. And the University of Kansas, 1968, his PhD, and the dissertation is Renaissance Attitudes on Marriage, Love, and Sexual Mores in the Heptameron of Marguerite de Navarre. He has an interest, obviously, in the Renaissance, short story, social commentary on life, and so forth, customs in 16th century France. So we should have something authoritative then on the Renaissance, and the Renaissance gentleman then in France.
Thank you. The gentleman of 16th century France is a hybrid species. He appears to be a composite of his illustrious past, the Middle Ages, a product of the Italian Renaissance, and finally of forging on native ground of diverse elements which history and fiction have variously depicted as courage, honor, refinement, and braggadocio. In attempting to explain the gentleman of the French Renaissance, we shall speak about those elements which shed the most light on his character: the sense of the past, concepts of gentility, his education, warfare, honor, and finally the role of women in the gentleman's life. The first recorded appearance in French literature of the term gentleman is found in the Song of Roland, the great epic of the 11th century. The author states with pride that the French are very much gentilhomme. I'm sure that's not how they pronounced it in those days, but anyway. The meaning of the word in Old French was closely allied to the concept expressed in Latin by gentilum hominem, that is, a man of race and family, and by extension, a man of good family. By the 16th century, this original meaning was still viable. The gentleman was first of all a noble, most likely the descendant of a medieval knight. However, as the age of chivalry passed into the Renaissance, many of the prerogatives of the medieval knight were taken away from his descendants with the progress of the centralized power of the monarch. The practice of bestowing the rights and privileges of chivalry was now reserved by the crown. However, the nobleman who was descended from the chevalier of the Middle Ages was held in high esteem by King Francis I. His was the ancient nobility, the nobility of the sword, and he was officially a gentleman. His position was one of priority and continuity and had nothing to do with personal qualities. He occupied a place that put him in the top military, governmental, and social brackets, and he held it until death, unless he disgraced himself in some way before the king. The inherited position of the gentleman of the 16th century was secure. He had responsibilities which were well defined, such as allegiance to king and country, and privileges, such as exemption from taxation and the right to ambassadorships and seats on the king's councils. The legality of his gentility could be confirmed by consultation of the records, and the brilliance of his dress marked him as a gentleman for everyone to see. Yet none of these trappings gave any indication whether underneath he was a man of honor or a deceptive fop. Guidelines and criteria had been set down, however, and various concepts of gentility were found in writing. The 13th century allegorical poem, The Romance of the Rose, enumerated the inner qualities a gentleman should possess and suggested what ideological attributes a gentleman should have. In the first part of the poem, the young lover is told that artificiality of rank does not make one noble, that true nobility is the product of natural courtesy, valor, merit, and good manners. As elsewhere, the philosophical and literary ideas of Greece and Rome found a renewed welcome in France during the Renaissance. Many of the graces of character to be sought in a gentleman stemmed from classical antiquity, especially from Plato and Aristotle. Several of Plato's dialogues were translated into French during the 16th century, but it is in his Republic that we really find his most significant opinions on man and his connection with the state. The medieval and Renaissance idea that the ideal gentleman was to be of the well-born class found support in Plato, who believed that the citizens of the ideal state were not all equal, and that basically class distinction should be maintained. Since the 16th century, gentleman was almost surely a warrior. Plato's comments on the education of the warrior, the courage he should possess, and the harmonizing of passion and reason through education were likewise of interest to the Renaissance gentleman. Aristotle stressed even more than Plato the desirability of moderation and temperance in one's actions. The primary Aristotelian doctrines dealing with the ideal of gentility are found in the Nicomachean Ethics, a work which was well known during the French Renaissance. In the Ethics, virtue is superior to honor, though men of refinement like to be honored if they are virtuous. Virtue also enters into the composition of happiness. As for the question of happiness, there are certain external advantages, the lack of which is a deterrent to the greatest earthly contentment, such as good birth, satisfactory children, and personal beauty. These are things that we should have in order to be truly happy. In the discussion of intellectual and moral virtues, Aristotle takes up the question of moderation and the golden mean. Although the intellectual virtues such as wisdom and understanding are not disparaged, more attention is given to the moral virtues such as liberality and temperance. Moral or ethical virtue is the product of habit, and nature gives us the capacity to receive these virtues. Training in childhood is important since we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. In all actions, the perfect mean is to be sought. Strength is destroyed by too much or too little exercise, health by too much or too little food, and so forth. Apropos of courage, a virtue dear to the heart of the Renaissance man, Aristotle said that it is best shown in dangers where a man can defend himself with valor or die nobly. Indeed, a courageous man endures for the sake of what is noble. Cowards are degraded by situations which bring out the best in brave men, and therefore brave men are always to be held in honor. Citizen soldiers fight to the death more than mercenaries because the citizen feels that it is a disgrace to run away. The Ethics devotes several passages to the ancestor or to an ancestor of the Renaissance gentleman, the great-souled man, who is generous without hope of return, disdainful of position and fortune, and is concerned with undertakings of distinction. With due allowance for some semantic inexactitude in the transfer of Plato and Aristotle into Renaissance French, these two philosophers were very much in the background of the concept of gentility in the 16th century. To the legacy of classical ideas on gentility must be added those of the Italian writers of the 16th century. The Italians at this time were much interested in what constituted gentility, and the two most famous treatises on the subject were Castiglione's Courtier and Giovanni della Casa's Galateo. In the former, the young courtier is admonished to be adept in the use of weapons, to be distinguished in feats of arms, and to have no stain of cowardice on him. He should avoid boasting and praising his own deeds, though he may mention them with proper modesty. He should be a good horseman, skillful at hunting, swimming, tennis, and vaulting, and be brave in individual combat. On the other hand, tumbling and climbing a rope are not suitable for a gentleman. I suppose because the mountebanks and the traveling people that came into town did these things who were obviously not gentlemen. He should have comeliness and grace, but not really be pretty. He should not be too large or too small. It is better that he be of moderate size, for men too large are clumsy. This is a curious bringing over of Aristotle's idea of moderation in the ethical sense into the physical sense here, when one didn't really have much control over this. Both slovenliness and over-preciseness are to be avoided. Simplicity is to be sought in all activities. Everything that the courtier does should appear easy and done without thought or effort, and there's great emphasis put on this. Everything is done very smoothly and without any effort, as though no practice or anything has gone into it. To these elements of temperance, courage, and skill in sports, there should be found in the courtier the solid quality of judgment, since his prince will need from time to time to ask his advice. On the subject of love, which is defined as a coveting of beauty by the senses, by reason and by understanding, sensual love is not condemned, especially in younger courtiers, but the ideal is reached when man is free from the vexations and suspicions of corporeal beauty and carries the concept of his lady in his heart. And there is a strong argument, I know, for the courtier as being one of the Bibles of Neoplatonism during the Renaissance. But if you read it very carefully, you find that it's nothing of the kind. Sensuality is quite acceptable in the young and rather disgusting in the old, and somewhere along the way one makes the transference, which is not specified how it's done, but anyway. The Galateo is concerned more with manners than with ethical and moral problems, and is based on the assumption that a gentleman wants to be pleasant and agreeable wherever he is. It's a compendium of courtesies that would still be taken for granted by cultivated people anywhere today. Hence, I'm not going to go into its precepts here. They mention the kind of things like don't wipe your greasy hands on the tablecloth, don't pick your nose in public, and a whole series of not too interesting manners. In France, then, the principles of the courtier and the Galateo were quickly adapted and put into practice, and there is much discussion of them in the literature of the time. In Montaigne's essays, in Ronsard's discourse on the moral and intellectual virtues, and of course in Rabelais' idealized society of Theleme, inhabited by the well-born and free, in which the only rule is to do as you will. If concepts of gentility were steady and there was no major difference of opinion on what constituted gentility, the same cannot be said of the gentleman's education. The Renaissance theorizers on education took an almost malicious pleasure in attacking the cherished and hallowed educational ideals of the past, which emphasized rote memorization, theology, and ecclesiastical philosophy. The book of The Courtier encouraged the gentleman to be a cultivated dilettante rather than a scholarly recluse, and held out some hope for the progress of intellectual activities in France under the aegis of Francis I. Francis did not fall too far short of Castiglione's prediction. He had received a classic education of sorts and could write and speak Latin like his English counterpart Henry VIII. In fact, one of the significant renaissances of the Renaissance was an interest in the study of language. It became progressively the fashion for a gentleman to have some knowledge of ancient and modern languages. At the Royal College, established in 1530, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin were taught. By 1500, there was a large number of displaced Greeks in France who were willing to give public and private lessons in their native language to interested persons. Italian was often spoken in court circles, and most courtiers could read Italian well enough and speak some, due to their long sojourns in Italy during the military campaigns. The most extensive program of education for the gentleman, though, is detailed in Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel, in which he offers a program geared to produce the universal man of the Renaissance, astute of mind and adept at physical endeavor. In the much-quoted letter of Gargantua to Pantagruel, father proceeds to elaborate to son all the present-day possibilities for learning and the things he would like his son to know. Very little is omitted from the program. Young Pantagruel is to learn Latin, Hebrew, Chaldean, Arabic, Greek, and several of the liberal arts, such as geometry, arithmetic, and music. He is also to study civic law and the natural sciences in depth. Gargantua closes his letter with the wish that his son become a chasm of knowledge filled to the brim. As with so many Renaissance education programs, it would take a giant in mind and body to carry out this one, yet Rabelais' giant has a gentleman's responsibility to society, as the letter clearly indicates. Toward the end of the century, many theories were offered concerning the type of education appropriate for a gentleman. Montaigne has much to say on the subject, and he is generally opposed to the encyclopedic gulping down of knowledge suggested by Rabelais. His longest essay, dealing with the subject on the training of children, contains the remark that the child's tutor should have a head that is well balanced rather than well stuffed. Montaigne prefers good tutors to studying in the colleges. He considers that he was himself very lucky in having teachers who did not disgust him with books, but rather inspired in him a love for learning. Although Montaigne respected the wisdom of the ancients, he had at the same time a horror of what he called college-bred Latinizers. He approved of the study of foreign languages, but insisted that they be begun in youth, as his own study of language had. He thought the young gentleman would be benefited greatly by travel, not as a tourist, but as a serious student of foreign customs. Montaigne had little faith or hope for the progress of mass instruction, and he comes back regularly in his essay to the materials and methods of teaching in France. And he says, "I return willingly to this matter of the futility of our method of instruction. It has for its purpose not to make us good and virtuous, but learned. It has had some success in that. It has not taught us to follow and embrace prudence and virtue, but it has impressed on our minds their derivation and etymology. We know how to decline virtue, even if we have no affection for it." Despite the fantastic programs that had been devised for him, the gentleman of the Renaissance was only a modest scholar. He undoubtedly knew some Italian and Latin and a smattering of the other liberal arts, depending on the schools he went to or on the whim of his tutor if he received private lessons. The gentleman, then, was no ivory tower recluse. By training and experience, as one author of the period has succinctly put it, by training and experience, he was more at ease outdoors with a horse and indoors with a woman than with a book in either place. Indeed, the preferred vocation of a gentleman was unquestionably that of arms. Once again, the writers of the period had their say about the value of the warrior's life in molding the character of the gentleman. Castiglione felt that the gentleman should be trained in arms as well as letters, and that making war is an honorable pursuit. Machiavelli, in The Prince, praised France because of the toughness and independence of her nobility, and admonished his countrymen to emulate the French if they would be free of foreign occupation. Montaigne went so far as to say that the profession of the soldier was the proper sole and essential life for one of the nobility. Turning now to a discussion of the gentleman at war, we discover that his general battle array consisted of a complete set of armor and 3 horses, 2 for service and 1 for his baggage. He carried a lance, and after the first impact fought with a sword in the event that the lance was shattered or lost. The man of arms became a fully equipped lance when supported by archers and light cavalrymen. The armies of the period were quite larger, certainly I think larger than most of us imagine. When Francis I left to conquer Milan in 1523, he was accompanied by nearly 42,500 troops, including Frenchmen and mercenaries, and this figure does not include those lances and mercenaries set aside to guard the frontiers. By the time of Henry II, when the use of artillery and gunpowder had become common, the moving of an army and its equipment became a complicated maneuver. The French armies were renowned for their bravery, for the decorum displayed in the operations of their armies, and for genteel actions and courtesies displayed to the enemy. Vieilleville, in his memoirs, recounts that during an uprising around Bordeaux in 1549, that he was very careful to pay for all lodging and billeting and punish any of his men who were found guilty of pillaging. Full protection, or at least moderately full protection, was also given to the feminine population of the city. Even the stern general, Blaise de Montluc, accepted a present from the enemy in the gallant fashion of the day. On Christmas Eve of 1554, Marignan, the Spanish commander in northern Italy, sent Montluc as a little token of the season half a stag, 6 capons, 6 partridges, 6 flagons of Trebbian wine, and 6 loaves of white bread for a party the next day. Montluc responded in kind and noted in his memoirs, "All these courtesies are very genteel and praiseworthy, even among the greatest enemies, if there is no understanding between them, as was the case with us. He was serving his master, and I was serving mine. He wished to add to his reputation as a soldier, and I to mine. It is to act like Turks and Saracens, to refuse little courtesies to one's enemy." Of course, there was the distaff side as well. Gallantry in battle probably wore thin as soldiers died from wounds and diseases, and the contagious malady, variously called the Neapolitan disease and at other times the French disease, was a common troop ailment. What doctors were available were distrusted. The chronicler Tavannes adequately sums up the feeling toward medicine and its practice on the battlefield when he states that the razor posing as a friend has done more harm than the bullets of the enemy. Closely allied to the spectacle of the gentleman at war is the concept of the gentleman's code of honor. If the nobleman risked his life for France on the battlefield, he also had a fair chance of putting it in jeopardy on the field of honor. The accounts of the time are replete with descriptions of duels, although the chroniclers offer divergent views on the value and ethics of dueling. Brantôme described the church's condemnation of duels, citing examples from the Bible of righteous dueling, such as the duel between David and Goliath. Montaigne, on the other hand, abhorred dueling, especially those prompted by a lady's misplaced smile or an assumed misunderstanding. It seemed ironic to him that men should sacrifice their lives for things that did not really matter at all. Duels were usually fought when gentlemen felt their honor and glory were at stake. Roughly defined, honor was the concept of esteem and dignity associated with one's character, and glory pertained more to the externals such as reputation and the value set on human respect. The classic duel of the 16th century in France between Jarnac and La Chataigneraie is representative of the complexities involved in an affair of honor. And I hope this comes across in what I'm going to say. It is also evidence of the high-level intrigue which was often at the base of this type of absurd slaughter. Both noblemen, Jarnac and La Chataigneraie, the best of friends, were prominent at the court of Francis I. The esteem in which they were held caused jealousy among court factions, and a successful attempt was set in motion which drew the two friends apart. A rumor stated that La Chataigneraie said Jarnac had boasted to him of having slept with his own stepmother. Although in his refutation of the charge, Jarnac did not use La Chataignerai's name, but stated, "Whoever had said that he, Jarnac, had boasted of sleeping with his stepmother was wicked and ill-fated and had lied." Nevertheless, the harm had been done. In order to remove suspicion from himself, Jarnac had to call La Chataigneraie a liar. Despite their long-standing friendship, La Chataigneraie, to protect his honor, had to sue for a duel. The process was begun by the issuing of a cartel de défi. The cartel de défi were a sort of formal challenge or threat, and often they were put and received in writing. So they were issued on the part of the defendant. La Chataigneraie lashed out at Jarnac in 3 cartels, which were sent in order to make them more emphatic, first to the king. The second cartel was perhaps the most inflammatory. In it, La Chataigneraie states, "Sire, in the quarrel that exists between Jarnac and me, up to the present I have considered the preservation only of my own honor, without bringing into play that of ladies, of whom I am traditionally the defender rather than the accuser, even of the one about whom there is question in our quarrel. But granting that, for my own justification, it is indeed required that I state that the said Jarnac had his will with his stepmother, and that he told me he slept with her and mounted her." This is exactly from the diary of La Chataigneraie, or the cartel. The duel took place on June the 11th, 1547, and Jarnac emerged the victor, leaving his adversary bleeding to death on the field of honor, the tendons in the calf of his left leg having been severed. In keeping with the demands of the Code of Honor, it is more than obvious that after a certain point had been reached, the Jarnac-La Chataigneraie duel had to be fought. Jarnac could not possibly have ignored the arrogant and scandalous cartels issued by La Chataigneraie, even had he suspected that malicious gossip had been at the base of the quarrel. Similarly, La Chataigneraie had to expunge his honor and reputation of any taint of lying or deceit, even if his private convictions led him to believe that he was being drawn into a network of intrigue. Later chroniclers believe that this mixture of farce and tragedy, which ended on the dueling field, began as a piece of gossip started by two court mistresses in an attempt to ward off scandal and to take themselves out of the limelight. The French court of the 1540s was filled with the bitter rivalry of the Duchess of Étampes and Diane de Poitiers. The Duchess's power over King Francis was declining at this time, and the glamorous Diane de Poitiers, now in the ascendancy, was reputed to be involved in an incestuous liaison with both father and son, that is, with Francis and the young Dauphin, Henry. Therefore, in the emotional convolutions of high-placed feminine rivalries, a malicious story as a counter-irritant was spread concerning Jarnac and his stepmother. The influence of women, then, was very much in the foreground of the general experience of Renaissance life, and the gentleman was by his own choice, and in keeping with the example set by his king, very much in the society of women, often to his great peril, as we've just seen, yet to theirs as well, as we shall see. Women seemed to hold sway, at least in the courtly circles. Such royal mistresses as Madame de Chateaubriand and the Duchess of Étampes held undisputed power during the periods of their supremacy, and the most famous triangle of the century, that of Catherine de' Medici, Henry II, and Diane de Poitiers, endured despite Queen Catherine's repeated attempts to discredit Diane, and despite Diane's 20-year seniority over Henry. She was apparently a very remarkable woman. The best expression of the idealized woman of the period is found in the poetry, especially that of Du Bellay and Ronsard. Ronsard, in one of his earliest odes, gives in full detail the glamorous attributes of the ideal lady. I include here the details which seem most appropriate for citation. She is young, has black eyes, although some in France prefer green eyes, dark complexion, and has small rounded breasts. She must be erect of figure, not too lean in the legs and torso, have pink cheeks, white teeth, sweet breath, small feet, and long, slender hands, suitable for playing the lute and for giving caresses. In order for the ladies to remain at court, they had to possess both wit and beauty, and although the deeply learned woman was not admired during the period, certain accomplishments were taken for granted. Singing, dancing, playing the lute, embroidery, and tapestry weaving were de rigueur. Knowledge of literature and of such languages as Latin and Italian were signs of further accomplishment. Catherine, Diane, and Madame de Chateaubriand all qualified in these areas, and it was their intelligence as well as their beauty that created the brilliance of the French court of the 16th century. The most complete picture, however, of the reality of sexual relationships and of the aspirations of women in a masculine-dominated society is found in Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron. The linguistic and philosophical capacities of the sister of Francis I were among the most celebrated of her day. Yet she is chiefly remembered today for the Heptameron tales, which have variously been passed off as the French Decameron and as little more than a collection of bawdy stories intended to while away the tedium of the last years of King Francis. The Heptameron, though, is the flip side of the coin, the reverse of the gallantry expressed in the poetry of the era. In this work, the various amatory tactics and strategies of the warrior gallants of Francis I's court are examined, and the apparent finesse of much of Renaissance life is belied by the courtiers' actions, which range from rape to ambush to gentle persuasion. In short, the end justified the means where amatory escapades were concerned. Marguerite succeeds in presenting a contemporary reflection of various Renaissance attitudes on love: Platonic, marital, naturalistic, and romantic. She concludes that the only satisfactory form of love is marital. Other forms which are visionary, such as Platonic-inspired liaisons, or exclusively sensual in orientation, are doomed to tragic failure because of their unstable foundation. We have seen that the gentleman of the Renaissance, in relationship to women, emerges as a less heroic character than in other endeavors. Or better stated, as a lover, the literature of the period depicts him as a sometime Platonist, but more often as an enterprising roue bent upon sexual gratification. Fidelity is definitely not his forte. His idea of sexual morality is to have no more than one wife and mistress at a time, and above all, to protect the reputation of the lady whose favors he is enjoying at the moment. In concluding our remarks on the gentleman of the French Renaissance, let us emphasize that he was an amalgam of various influences which synthesized in France early in the 16th century. He was strongly affected by many phases of the Italian Renaissance. He adopted a number of the refinements and courtesies of the Italian gentleman living in such cultivated places as Florence and Venice. The Italian manuals of correct conduct, too, had a great influence on French manners of the 16th century, though the French gentleman was not quite like his model, the Italian gentiluomo. He may have lacked some of the elegance of his Italian counterpart, but he probably had a keener sense of honor. Despite his refinements, the gentleman believed that in sexual conduct, a man's honor and a woman's honor should be judged by different measurements, and he accepted with aplomb the double standard. Finally, he basked in the confidence the spirit of the Renaissance produced, took delight in its renewed zest for life on this earth, and cut an impressive figure in the short golden age of his life, which spanned little more than the first half of the 16th century. Thank you. Are there any questions or discussion? Quentin?
One point in the remarks we quoted a reference to behavior being like that of Saracen. I want to raise a question about the question of whether or not there are elements contributory to this conception of the gentleman from Islam, from the Orient.
You mean the idea that the gentleman would be just the opposite of a Turk or a Saracen?
Well, I was wondering if there are any positive contributions from the Orient.
Not that I really know that I can think of. When they do cite something that's Oriental, it's usually in a more or less a derogatory way. As this is considered to be still the medieval idea of being an infidel, and putting Christianity in jeopardy is still strongly felt. Of course, I think especially at this period, because the 16th century society in France it is really still in a transitional stage. It definitely is Renaissance, but the roots of the medieval period have not completely left. Especially the person I quoted from was Montluc, who was very much God and country and church, and he might have had a little stronger opinion on this than most, but yet I would say his referring to Turks or Saracens in a derogatory manner would not be unusual. Dale?
What role does the church play in moderating the behavior of the gentleman?
I don't has much of an influence at all, really. I think that the church of the period, although they had to officially, in a pulpit sense, come out and condemn the double standard of Renaissance life, certainly they looked the other way at it in real practice, because the realities of the situation just called for this kind of life. People were married off in very early ages, and there was really the few marriages that were, the arranged marriages that were successful were phenomenal, but there really is no strong church condemnation of this at all. I think this was just the flesh, which the church has always spoken against, but always accepted the manifestations of, and there has never been really any, and of course many of the clergymen at the time, this is another aspect of the Heptameron that I didn't bring out because it didn't apply here. I mean, their morals were not exemplary too. Yes?
By the time Molière began writing, had there been that much social change between what people thought a noble and gentle man should be like? Or was it just, let's say, at Molière in literature, when he wrote, for instance, the Bourgeois Gentilhomme, was it that much change socially and between all the way all people thought? Or was it mostly men in literature and philosophical thought that thought differently about the way the gentlemen should be acting or the way they did act?
Well, now you're getting into, with Molière, of course, you're getting into a different society in a different century, and I think that the concept of, depending on which way you look at it, the concept of the gentleman by the 17th century in France either degenerated or became hyper-refined, depending on if you, because the gentleman of the 16th century was very, very honorable in certain ways, but very dishonorable in others. I mean, he was definitely a male chauvinist, although he would die to the death for some minor point of honor on the field of battle or something, and would refuse to turn his back to the enemy. But I think when you get into the 17th century, and he was not this idea of being a fop or being prissy or being sort of a fancily dressed mannequin, which you get the idea of in Molière, really did not exist in the 16th century. So when Molière comes to satirizing this in his plays, I think he's satirizing something that was viable and had some life in the 16th century, but had become more or less an outdated and foolish practice, just foppery and pretense and show, like Monsieur Jourdain and the Bourgeois Gentilhomme. Excuse me, please.
Were sexual aberrations considered the way of life, or was the attitude a little more puritanical?
I think that there was no idea of, as we would understand the word puritanical, I don't think that word would be applicable at all. I think that the sexual aberrations as such were produced by the really difficult situation that most people, there were very few marriages of inclination or love. And of course, once again now, I'm limiting myself to the upper class. I mean, I'm not talking about the common people. And of course, you might say on this level, one liaison or one affair after another was rank. And it just was the accepted thing. Now, in the Heptameron, there is sort of a strong feminist approach taken against this, that women are not supposed to be the playthings of the warrior gallants. But even with all of her preaching against this, you might say King Francis's sister, Margaret of Navarre, realizes that this, because there are very few marriages of love or inclination, this is a natural concomitant of this forced social structure which they live in. And while though she, as a woman, because it debases her dignity and the dignity of all other women, whereas she rejects it in the abstract, she says, well, what else can we expect as long as this goes on?
How did they feel about the homosexual situation? Did they accept it as a way of
This became more of that type of aberration became more prominent toward the end of the century. The last of the Valois kings, Henry III, was queer, and this was not much of a problem. You don't read of in even the most gossipy chronicles like Brantôme, who seemed to have been in every nook and cranny and under every royal Now, the thing he misses in his memoirs I don't think there's anything in there about this, and I'm sure that had it even been in the air, he would have found out, because he was just that kind of a nosy person. So this didn't seem to be a problem at the time.
I mean, it wasn't anything extreme, such as the accepted homosexual relationship, and women were only for procreation. Nothing that extreme.
No, I think that the idea is the dichotomy, the more normal dichotomy would have been that your legal married wife was for the purposes of procreation, and if you really loved the woman, in a sense you were defiling her. You worked out all these baser instincts on your mistress, and when you were purified, you came back to your wife.
The comment you made, the gentleman's question about Moliere, would that also apply to the way in which Rostand, for example, uses the précieux in Cyrano? The précieux had been part of the 16th century, the Renaissance,
Mm-hmm.
and at that point in time, that would have been considered proper behavior. It satirized the 19th century.
I think with Cyrano, the redeeming quality there, the thing that keeps him, although he is a précieux, what keeps him from being a real fop is his tremendous wit and his real verbal agility and his ability to just pull these conceits out of the air and somehow just make them fit together very beautifully. And I think Molière Molière would have admired wit as well as any other writer of the 17th century. But what he, I think, attacked in his plays were the false wits, the people that he said had this mania to get themselves in print and writing. In other words, regardless of what they had to say, or whether it was the worst type of doggerel at all, like Oronte, if you read the Misanthrope by Molière, Oronte insists on reading his sonnet in front of Alceste, knowing that, really, and Alceste has given him many clues. He doesn't want to listen to it. He doesn't want to make a judgment on it because he's heard that Oronte is a bad poet, and of course he just unleashes on him when it says, this is terrible, this is doggerel, you're a terrible writer, why don't you quit? And of course, he's vestiges of the old code of honor. A lawsuit is brought against him for having insulted Oronte in his literary talent. But this is the kind of fop, or the kind of false wit, or false précieux, you might say, that Molière would attack. But for all of his carping and attacking of préciosité, I think Molière, being a man of the 17th century, would admire true wit. And I think that Cyrano is a true wit. He's not the run-of-the-mill précieux. At least he doesn't seem like that to me. I don't. Maybe I'm too close to all this in French. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you for your participation.